Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I first was here, it must be possibly 30 years ago, 25 years ago, and I was put to bed, no, I went to bed myself, sorry, in a room that was once occupied by Daniel O'Connor, of course, the person who was the responsible for Catholic emancipation in 1825, I think when it was, so that was a great proud moment. Before that, I was taken for drinks to the rather splendid library that we're talking about, the wonderful house over there. And I was asked that very awkward question, like, what would you like to drink? And if you don't know what there is, do I ask for a nice malt or whatever, you know? And I thought, well, I can't see any drinks around. And then, you know, the principal moved over to this incredible library thing, bookshelves and everything, pressed a button, and the whole bookcase opened and revealed the most splendid set of drinks I think I've ever seen in my life. So that was my first introduction. But since then I've been here several times now as examiner on the course. So thank you very much for inviting me back. Now, the title is Academies, but I want to lead up to that because I think we're now seeing in our schools possibly the most radical changes, and I think bad changes that we've seen, most radical changes since 1944. And so I want to lead up to that and why I think we ought to be worried. I just want to say that those of you who haven't got much history, it was 1944 which introduced secondary education for all. It was a great act, of course. It came on before the end of the war, looking ahead to rebuilding Britain. And the great important thing about that act was that no one should have too much power. Basically, it said we need a maintained system of education. That is, not a state schools, but maintained schools. And that the secretary, or the minister, as it was then, had very, very few powers. In fact, he had three. One was to approve or disapprove recommendations from local education authorities to open or close schools. Second was to make sure there's an adequate supply of teachers. And the third one was to be able to remove air raid shelters from schools left over after the war. So when I joined the civil service in 1962, as in the administrative class civil service, the people who ran education in this country from the government, we had sherry parties every so often in a space that was about a fifth of this room. Now, of course, you're talking about several hundred. And when I first joined, I was told that your main thing to remember is that you don't have to know anything about what you're doing. And I thought this is a really great job for life. But meaning what? This civil service serving the minister, and the minister would not claim to have anything knowledge about professional matters. So I worked in private office with that great Secretary of State, minister still then, Edward Boyle, and whenever he had anything professional at all, he would always have the chief inspector or the staff inspector there, and he would always defer to them on any kind of professional matter. So what I'm saying is, you had a system there where there was very little power, and of course, one of the reasons for that was quite clearly after the war, one had seen what had happened in those countries where there was that central power, and where the Secretary of State could decide, or sorry, the government could decide what should be the history curriculum, or the government could decide that climate change should not be in the geography syllabus, all right? And that's what was not wanted at all. So it was a maintained system of education. Whereas now, what has happened with academies and with free schools is, of course, each of these is under direct contract to the Secretary of State. And where the Secretary of State, therefore, has the powers over such schools, they're no longer protected by the 1944 Education Act. And therefore, the academies and the free schools are under direct contract to the Secretary of State, such that the Secretary of State can, if he wants, and given due notice, can actually say, no, you're not allowed to do that. Or we're going to withdraw your funding. And this has happened on one or two things. I actually did a debate in the committee rooms of the House of the Lords for the Parliamentary Skills Committee some time ago and was debating with Toby Young, who started off, of course, the free schools. And I was able to say that why do you call them free schools? They're free in one sense, but you don't need to be a great philosopher to realize you're not just free, you're free to do something, you're free from something. So you are free from the control or the responsibility, if you like, of the local education authority, but only because you have signed this contract. You have now become enslaved to the Secretary of State. So we're now developing, in my view, the most centralized system of education that we have known in Western Europe since Calvin's Geneva in the 16th century. And when I said that, I got a loud cheer from the noble lord, not that they've done anything about it, and I was accused of being aggressive by Toby Young. Well, I'm not. And what happens is that the evidence for the free schools that Michael Gove put forward was based upon the free schools in Sweden. That's the evidence they pointed to. Well, I was in Sweden not long ago giving a lecture at the University of Gothenburg, and I mentioned this, and I got the biggest guffaw that I've ever had in my life. Because all the evidence is now, read Per Thulberg's research on this, is that the free schools are seen to be a bit of a disaster in Sweden. Or it was based on the evidence of the charter school movement in America. But if you read the Stanford research on this, once again, these are being seen as a failure in many cases. So we haven't got that kind of evidence base anymore for this sort of policy. And I think that this is very important to remember, because one of the great advocates of the charter schools, which was the basis of a lot of the thinking of Michael Gove, is of course run by Noel Klein, who was the superintendent of New York schools. Now, until the scandal over Liam Fox and his sidekick on when he was the Secretary of State for War, or for Defence, oh gosh, is there a difference? He was a member of what was called the Atlantic Bridge. The Atlantic Bridge was a meeting of right-wing politicians in this country. It included Liam Fox, Michael Gove, and Osborne, a bridge between them and the right-wing Republicans, the Tea Party, in the United States. And of course one member of this was Noel Klein. Murdoch was very much involved, and so on. And so there is, and read Diana Ravitch's work on this, there is a kind of cross-Atlantic view as to how education should be run and the importance of it increasingly being run by business. Noel Klein is actually employed by Murdoch running Wireless Generation, which seeks now to control a lot of education, the resources to education, and indeed change of schools. And had it not been for the phone hacking, the hacking scandal of the News of the World and so on, then I think we would now be having our schools and much of our services to schools being run by the empire Wireless Generation of Murdoch. So I think there's now been terrific change, and it's going on apace, and I think that we ought to be deeply anxious. So I want to then follow that up to some extent. And I think that the way, what we're being talking about constantly now is that of raising standards. And I think that if you actually look at the language, and I think we've got to look at language. Wittgenstein said somewhere, I think it was in the Philosophical Investigations, that my main task, my aim, is to enable you to move from what is hidden nonsense to what quite clearly is patent nonsense. And I think it's the language through which we come to actually embrace a particular way of life, a particular way of thinking. But as soon as you begin to analyse it, like free schools, does anybody begin to unwrap what we mean by free schools, then I think we realise what difficulties I think we're in. Because there is a language which just would have been regarded as risible only 20 or 30 years ago, through which now education is talked about in terms of raising standards. one talks about targets, and there's a whole history of the use of that word target, because a target has to be very precise, and therefore standards are identified with targets, which are more and more identified with particular behavioural measurable outcomes. We talk about the delivery of those targets, and indeed one of the great friends of Noel Klein, who was invited over from Britain because he had made such a great success, according to Noel Klein, of the schools in this country, was Sir Michael Barber, who was in charge of delivery at number 10 Downing Street, and has a whole science of delivery, and has even set up, when he was invited across to America, a centre for deliverology in Washington. Am I right? I'm not kidding. And there is a science of deliverology which you can apply to cornflakes, children, and everything. He's now, by the way, over in Pakistan, delivering Pakistan's education, I can tell you. I think that, anyway, I won't go on about Pakistan, but I have been there 20 times, and I think that will defeat Michael Barber. And of course, if you have these very precise things, then of course it's league tables and performance, performativity, auditing your performance outcomes. Teachers are seen regularly now as the people who are going to deliver the curriculum, which is being created elsewhere. At the moment, Michael Gove is writing the geography curriculum. So you deliver, and of course increasingly teachers are seen as deliverers to their clients or to their customers. So there's a whole language which actually transforms our views about what education is. And it's that which I really want to challenge. So what is wrong with that? And I think really how we think about schools, how we think about education, does depend so much on the kind of metaphors which we use. And I want to say, if you're talking about educating persons, you've got to start thinking a little bit more philosophically about what we mean to be a person, to grow and to develop as a person. And some years ago, quite a long time ago now, I went across to the States for a term to spend it, but I only spent some of it, with Lawrence Kohlberg at Harvard's Center for Moral Development that he'd established. And he did all the work on, all that very, very good work on moral development. But one of the kind of problems that Kohlberg found, you could get young people to develop this capacity for moral reasoning, but they just carried on just the same. Now, what is the connection between thought and action? You could be a damn good canon lawyer, but and I've met a few when I was in Rome, but not always good people. I mustn't go on about that, but nonetheless, that's true. Now, so what he said, what Kohlberg argued, if you are going to help young people to become good people, where the thought and action become integrated, you've got to embody those values in the school itself. It's no good talking about justice to young people if they see a school that's operating blatantly in an unjust sort of way. So how do you embody those things? We then developed all this notion of the just community school. So when I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I went to visit one of these schools, Newton High. And I met there this incredible head teacher, a middle-aged lady running this school, about 3,000 young people, therefore a fairly large turnover of teachers. And so she sent this letter to the new teachers. Dear teacher, I'm the survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness. I saw gas chambers built by learned engineers. Children poisoned by educated physicians. Infants killed by trained nurses. Women and children shot and burnt by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing and arithmetic are important, but only if they serve to make our children more human. So that, therefore, seems to me our central task. How do we enable young children eventually to grow up and to become human in the full sense of that word? But that forces us to engage in really a bit of philosophical thinking about what we mean to be human and to become so more completely. And it is really a theme which has gone right the way through the history of education in terms of philosophers from Aristotle onwards have really addressed this sort of issue. But it's one that we've got to address before we start implementing a particular way of running schools, of league tables, and certainly if you read Mansell's book, Education by Numbers, how the league tables and the targets have really distorted what goes on in schools. And this is all very well documented. Smith Report 2004, Chief Inspector's Report 2009, the Royal Society's reports on the state of education, and so on and so forth. And it's all very, very brilliantly documented in Mansell's book. So we've got to then say, what does it mean to be human? Let us take then a different sort of metaphor. If you read, I think, those brilliant essays by the philosopher Michael Oakeshott, going back to the 1970s, he says, really, education is about, it's through education that you come to understand what it is to be human and how to grow and develop as such. And one key aspect of that is he talks about education, therefore, as introducing the next generation to what he calls the conversation between the generations of mankind. That conversation is the voice, he talks, of science, the voice of history, the voice of literature, the voice of drama, the voice of philosophy. You are through education, we are introducing these young people to those different voices through which the human condition has been examined, talked about, criticized, debated. The social context of that condition is also talked about and developed. It is a conversation. It is not a set of targets which you can reduce to very specific behaviors and test people on. And the point about any conversation is, of course, you're never quite sure what the end product is going to be. You don't know, these children struggling with these ideas might come out with different views. Of course, they're views which have to be constantly defended in terms of the evidence and the conversation that's gone on previously. But how can we help these young people to enter into that kind of conversation? At different levels, of course. But one hopes that sufficiently so that they will carry on thinking about the issues of what it is to be human, what it is to live in a thoroughly humane society. So therefore, central to development as a human being is to develop those kinds of knowledge and understanding which is enshrined within the arts, within the sciences and so on, through which they are able to understand the human condition and the social and economic conditions of which they live. And part of that understanding, my second little point here, is that what we referred in the Big Nuffield review of 14 to 19 as moral seriousness. How can we enable young people, through that discussion, through the arts and so on, come to develop a capacity to think seriously about the life worth living, about the dignity of other people as well as themselves? So that moral seriousness that is there. Practical capability. One of the sort of anxieties that I have about what's happened now because of the league tables, etc., is the way in which we have shown disdain, or the system has shown disdain, for the practical capabilities, for the kind of skills and knowledge which is at the basis of people doing and creating and making things. And of course now there's being a bit of a reaction against that, and Kenneth Baker is producing his university technical colleges, says, look, why do we not put engineering, design and engineering amongst the central things that we ought to be caring about in our schools? And you're familiar with the hullabaloo that arose about the reform of the examination system, the EBAC and the EBCs, whatever those are, and the fact that out of it they excluded the arts and they excluded engineering, design and engineering. And yet there is much about that conversation between the generation of mankind as all the others. And the fourth thing, the sense of community. Part of what it is to be human is to realize that we live interconnected and dependent upon the wider community and the wider social groups through which we live. How can we ensure that people... And of course, one of my great heroes was the philosopher John Dewey, because in Democracy in Education, he saw at the centre of education, it's getting people to realise they are belonging to a community, that if society is going to be improved, these are the new citizens, these therefore must learn to be able to live together, live in harmony, learn from each other, and grow. Part of their growth and development is through that social intermixing and being able to see more critically the ideas which one's own life depends upon, juxtaposed with those of others. I've got to be careful about talking about about Dewey, because when I first went to Oxford in 1989, I shared a platform with Keith Joseph. He was then retired, but he had been the most effective Secretary of State, I suppose, when he was under Margaret Thatcher, that probably we've had. And I was sitting next to him at dinner, and he turned round to me after the soup and waved his finger at me in a characteristic Keith Joseph way and said, is your name Pring? Which I couldn't deny at the age of 50. So I said, well, why? What have I done wrong? Because I knew I'd obviously done something wrong. He said, because you've caused all the problems in our schools. And I felt rather chuffed. You don't get that sort of compliment very often. And said, all of them? He said, yes. I said, well, why? He said, because you and people like you introduced teachers to John Dewey. And Dewey was seen because he was identified with child-centeredness and so on, and Plowden Report, etc. And therefore he was that was seen, and Dewey therefore was seen as the sort of evil one. Anyway, we carried on talking right through to the report, and then he said, we must carry on this conversation. So I toddled over to House of Lords like a little poodle to see him there, and then when he came up to Oxford we met and so on. And before he died he was converted, and he was sending people up to me to learn about John Dewey. But anyway, just before the election, Willits came up to see me. We had a very nice lunch in the Luna Prairie, which is one of the few restaurants that the Bullingdon Club dined in but didn't break up. And afterwards he said, look, that was very, very interesting. He said, but don't you think the main problem is John Dewey? And I thought, oh gosh, I've got to start all over again. Anyway, 6 months ago, Kenneth Baker wanted to see me about his UTCs and so on. So I went down faithfully to see him. And at the end of this conversation, I said, look, Lord Baker, I said, why are the Conservatives so against John Dewey? Do you know what his answer was? Who's John Dewey? We've got to be a bit careful. But really, if you really want a good philosopher who really thinks about what it is to enable kids to grow, and to grow as human beings, I think Dewey is the person. So that's it. To be human is to have that capacity to know and to understand the world, have a moral seriousness, practical capabilities, and have a sense of community. So what I want to say is, we need, in the light of that now, to rebel, I think, against that whole language of deliverology, of the metaphor brought from the business world, where the teacher is seen as a deliverer of. And I think, therefore, what I want to argue for, and have argued for, is we need to bring back teaching. Teaching in the sense that the teacher is the person who actually, on the one hand, understands, takes part in that conversation between the generations, as a historian, as a geographer, as a scientist, The teacher is the person who's intimate, loves and cares for that knowledge and understanding, and for the practical capabilities and so on, as the really good master craftsman would be with the practical skills, etc. And on the other hand, is able to relate that in some way to the minds and to the understandings of the neophytes there in the classroom, the young people who've got their own way of thinking, their own concerns and so on. And it seems to me the real pedagogical skills that the teacher has is to be able to make the connection between that which is regarded as valuable to know and to be able to do, and the minds of these young people. And what Dewey was against was the total failure of what he saw as the transmission model, where you say, these are your targets, learn them. And of course the evidence is people will learn. And the Smith report in 2004 showed that even those who had absorbed this and got grade A's and A stars in their A levels still hadn't got that basic understanding of the subject matter when they went on then to the university. So that is what the teacher. Dewey has this marvellous expression in which he talks about, the teacher as the usherer in of the kingdom of God. Oh yes, well that's a bit grand, I think, but nonetheless what he means is we have inherited a cultural richness that's there in the work of scientists, historians, theologians, philosophers and so on. How can we enable the pupils, at different levels of course, to participate to some extent in that cultural richness that's going to enable them to think more effectively and to care more carefully for other people and so on. And I don't think that this is just highfalutin thinking. I don't know, you see, what the saddest things that I find about the Gove's qualifications reforms, so-called, is the omission of any reference to the arts. And yet it's really the arts at their best, and in the hands of really good teachers of the arts, who are able to do more than almost anybody with some of the most difficult young people in order to transform their lives and enable them to be able to explore the very issues that they need to explore, to be able to see, to look critically at the sort of conditions and the society in which they live. I don't know whether any of you remember seeing on the television, must be 3 or 4 years ago now, a thing called Ballyhoo. And Ballyhoo was the English ballet company in Birmingham that, after a great deal of effort, working with probation officers, with youth workers, with teachers, with the police and so on, brought together over 100 young people, all of whom had been in trouble in one way or another, truanting from school, excluded from school, in trouble with the police, in care, running away from home, and persuaded them to take part in a ballet. This lot, a ballet, people would not associate ballet with this lot of young people. And it was Romeo and Juliet by Prokofiev. And finally they got them all, and they got them in it, working as technicians, dancing as dancers and so on. The whole thing was there. Those who still had parents around, their parents came, they'd never been to the theatre before, and they were absolutely knocked back by the performance. And it was brilliant. And, well, I'm not quite sure what grade she would get in her GCSE English, but Emma, who took the part of Lady Capulet, she was asked afterwards, well, what do you get out of this? She said, it changed my life. It's changed my life. Why? She said, I now understand my mum. Right, well, you wouldn't get grade A or whatever, but that's what I call an educative, transforming sort of experience. And the director of the English Ballet Company, the chief executive rather of the English Ballet Company, said, oh, of course, because Shakespeare, and being able to dance it, has everything for these young people. It's got knife crime, dysfunctional families, gang warfare, murder, Read David Lammy's book about the Rising from the Ashes, about the condition in which a lot of the young people were arrested for the autumn riots in Tottenham. There were 1,000 of them, and so on. About the kind of conditions in which these people live in the sort of gang world and so on. These were the youngsters. And I met the manager of the English Ballet Company quite a bit later at some sort of conference. I said, yes, but, you know, has it made a permanent difference? He said, every one of them is now employed. Working in the arts, working in technology, working something. It changed their sort of lives. So I just think we ought to be thinking about education now. Not hitting targets, not delivering what somebody has told you in the government that you've got to deliver, but in what is it that in my subject, in my expertise, and it helps young people to somehow transform their lives and to have a real sense of moral purpose and so on in it. But what then, coming back, do I think is worrying? There are lots of teachers who have that sort of aspiration. And no doubt you can go around many schools where they still maintained that real sense of moral purpose of what Dewey and others spoke about. But what worries me now is the way that's becoming more and more difficult, because the teachers are no longer at the centre of the thinking, but they're at the periphery, and the thinking is going on with all those civil servants and with their political advisors, and I've met quite a few, and the majority are still wrapped in their umbilical cords and yet somehow giving advice about how to run the system. Remember, and I mustn't be too romantic about the past. I remember when I first started teaching in 1965 in Camden Town at St. Richard of Chichester. I got my PGCE. I got in touch with the head teacher at the end of June or July. Could I have my timetable, please, so that I could spend my summer preparing my lessons for next year? And I got the reply saying, we don't know, Mr. Pring, what your timetable is going to be. If you come in very early, the first day of term, we'll give it to you. I thought, gosh, you know, what am I going to do and manage? And he said, when I went in, he said, and what did you do at the university? And I said, philosophy. He said, I thought so. I'm giving you the slow learners. Well, you know, I don't think that could happen now. You know, I mean, it's much more kind of professional. It's not much, we mustn't romanticize, too much about the past. But one of the things that I do remember when I was in the civil service, in a thing called the Curriculum Study Group, to be then moving, and the Curriculum Study Group was setting up a thing called the Schools Council. And the Schools Council was an effort on the part of the government to enable teachers to really take charge of the curriculum by giving them the framework and the resources to be able to develop their thinking about the curriculum. And out of this emerged great things. The science, Nuffield Science, the Humanities Curriculum Project, Geography Young School Leaver, History 13 to 16. These were thought through by the teachers and actually were implemented by the teachers in schools. And I think enormous amount came from them. And from that came things like the teacher centres. And all over the country there were these teacher centres. So when I was teaching at St. Richard's, I would go to the teacher centre and meet other teachers who were dealing with youngsters with special educational needs. And we would discuss our problems together. There's a real sense of partnership, teamwork across schools, in which we would share our problems and get this, in which we would develop little research projects in order to inquire into whether what we were doing was working or not. And of course all that has been swept away. So my view is, in Bring Back Teaching, in private provision, we must find a way in which teachers take much greater control. They're the expert, the pedagogical experts that link that which is the best that's been thought and said to the minds and the aspirations of the young people. But what happens now, I think, with the present developments in education is, first of all, and I mentioned this and don't need to go into it, but the central power of one person who is almost whimsical, in back of envelope, deciding what one should do. And one could go into this and question if you like, but the qualifications fiasco has really been one of the most unbelievable instances of this, by someone who has got no conception of, despite his being a historian, of the whole history, development of the examination system, to where they've constantly gone wrong with meddling and so on. You remember under the last government that Ed Balls was developing the 14 to 19 diplomas, and there was a lot of good thinking behind those diplomas, but he referred to these as being the qualifications of choice for young people in the future. 3 years later, they're dead. Think now of the number of young people who actually were persuaded to take those. And now I suspect if they go to an employer and say, I've got a level 2 diploma, the employer won't know what the hell you're talking about. So this is what happens when I think you put too much power into the hands of one particular person. I think that one of the kind of real difficulties that's been created by the academies and free schools is the fact the competitive nature between institutions now to go up the league tables, etc., or to stay open. And what we really ought to be doing is not thinking in terms of institution, but in terms of the young people that the institution serves. And if we think in terms of the young people rather than in the institution, then institutions would be cooperating rather than competing. Let me just explain. There are 500 secondary schools in this country that have got no qualified physics teacher. It means that youngsters going to those particular secondary schools will not have any basis whatsoever, really, in understanding physics, and therefore denied that opportunity to move on through, apart from general education, forward to universities and so on, higher education in the sciences, in physics particularly, and then in science degrees. If you've got small sixth forms, and once again under the academy programme, they're all being encouraged to develop sixth forms. But there's lots of evidence, going back years, from the National Audit Office onwards, which shows that if you have sixth forms below a certain number, then you're going to get poorer results and also a much more restricted number of A-levels that you can take. There are 8,000 possible combinations of A-levels in this country. If you find you take the wrong combination, then, and maybe you've got to, for the sort of course you want subsequently to do, then you're going to be denied opportunities. That's why the sixth form colleges, and I was addressing Hereford on Friday, the governing body there, the sixth form college, there are 94 of those in the country. Between them they have 150,000 students, and they get such good results at A-levels because they have the logistics of science. You can have a team of physicists, a team of chemists, a team of biologists. You can have an information advice and guidance service of 5 or 6 people at a time when finding your way through to what you should do after school is just so important. No one school, I don't think, can have, working by itself and not in partnership, can have the benefits of that independent, objective, highly knowledgeable information advice and guidance service. You go to, I was working quite a lot at Worcester Sixth Form College, where they had about 5 very professional information advice and guidance. They knew all the apprenticeships around the region. They knew all the employers. There wasn't a person leaving that college who wasn't going to university, who wasn't put onto an appropriate training track and so on, because of the connection between this team and all the local employers. They have the knowledge to be able to know what's required to get into different universities and different university courses. And that strikes me as where we need partnership, not competition between institutions. We are seeing, of course, now increasingly the for-profit people, the business people coming in and taking over chains of academies. And Murdoch would have been there had he not made such a mess of News Corps. But we're now seeing that. That just means money gets siphoned off schools to put into the pockets of people rather than going back into the schools themselves. So these are the reasons which I really feel that dream of providing education for all, helping all young people, irrespective of their background, irrespective of their level of intelligence, irrespective of their ethnicity or social class. That dream of providing education for all, which was there in the Newsom report in 1964, I feel that's going to be lost with now the ways in which organisationally things are going on, and the ways in which teachers are becoming increasingly limited in becoming, as it were, the usherers in of the kingdom of God. Right, thanks very much. Any questions?